I invite everyone to be seated, and I would like to invite forward Sam Altis, who's here with us from the Association of Faith Community Shelter.
Good morning.
Good morning, Sam.
Good to be with you all again. We have once again wrapped up another month of you all hosting the shelter, and I want to pass on for, I don't even know where we're at least the 6th month, I don't know, my gratitude for how many times you all have hosted our folks. This past month in February, you were very literally a shelter in the storm. So on the days where it was pouring rain outside and gusting wind, you opened up your building all day so they could stay safe and warm and relaxed. I could see a noticeable difference on their face when I would come into the shelter in the evening on those days, and they just seemed like they were more relaxed, the kind of the best versions of themselves. So thank you for that, for the wonderful meals, for the hospitality, and for all that you do for them. So let's get to the text. I normally like to preach on the gospel text because I like Jesus. I like his teachings. They're poignant, about mercy, justice, all kinds of great themes. But the first text we read from Numbers was just too wild not to be preached on. So we're going to talk about that. How often do you get a chance to talk about a snake invasion in church? So we're going to settle into that strange text. It kind of made me laugh because it's a ridiculous story a little bit, and the psalm right after it was a really funny contrast because it starts with "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good." And when I read that, I was like, except for the snake thing, like that wasn't great. It didn't seem like. It feels like a little bit of an overreaction on God's part, if we're being honest. The people complain about the quality of their food, and God gives them snakes instead. The text is only funny, and I think only helpful, if we don't actually think that God sent poisonous snakes to kill a bunch of his people. And I don't think that God actually sent poisonous snakes. Jesus tells us about God's nature actually in very similar terms. In one of his teachings, Jesus says, look, if a parent was asked by their child for food, they would not be given a snake. That would be a terrible parent. And Jesus says, how much better is God than a parent? So God will give you good things. Related to this story, I don't think God actually gave them poisonous snakes. If there were ever a symbolic text, I think this is one of them. It's a story about trying to get somewhere better, a promised land, if you will, and the highs and the lows that we experience along the way. In this text in particular, this comes in the middle of a long story about Israel being delivered from Egypt out of slavery in this dramatic, amazing fashion. And they're on their way to what they hope will be a better place, somewhere they can live and thrive and feel safe. But the journey turns out to be very long and very hard. The story today finds them at a particularly low point. In the chapter just before this, there were a couple really bad occurrences. Number one, their leader, Moses, had just had a really public failure. So God had told him to go get water from a rock, which is an unusual request, but there's a lot of unusual things in this part of the Bible. And he was supposed to talk to the rock, but he was getting frustrated and fed up, so he smacked the rock, still got water, but was very publicly chastised by God in the story. So that doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the people you're leading through the desert whenever you are questioning and wavering in faith. So they have a real crisis of leadership at the time. Their other leader, Aaron, Moses' brother, had just died. So they had been wandering in the desert for years, and one of their leaders dies before they ever make it to the promised land. So they are collectively starting to waver a little bit in their faith. And specifically, they start to say, maybe it was better in Egypt. Maybe we should have just stayed there in slavery instead of wandering through the desert. So they get some perspective in the story from God. They're sent what could be considered a different form of food. They're complaining about the food they have, and in a little twist of irony, God gives them another food source, but that food source ends up being poisonous snakes that end up biting them instead. The Hebrew word actually is not quite like what we think of as, a poisonous snake. It's a little more symbolic than that. It's actually the same word that's used in some of the prophetic literature of the Old Testament for these sort of like winged creatures that fly around in the temple in some of the visions. So they're serpent-like, but the idea is that they are the symbol of holiness, of fire, of power. It's the kind of thing that is powerful enough to either heal us or kill us, depending on how we approach it. And strangely, the presence of these snake-like things reminds them that things were actually much worse in Egypt than they were in the desert at that moment, and that the journey is not always smooth in moving towards wholeness. And then in a symbolic moment, they receive healing by looking on the very thing that is killing them. So God tells Moses, make a statue of one of these snakes. And when they look at it and face the thing that is killing them, they experience healing. What a story. What do we do with all of this? It's quirky, it's strange, but I still find it insightful in all of its strangeness. One thing that it does is it reminds me of the holiness of hard things in our lives. And here's what I mean by that. Like I said, I don't think God actually sent poisonous snakes to kill Israel. But I don't think it's unreasonable to think that they may have encountered poisonous snakes in the wilderness as they were wandering about, and they attributed them to God. That hardship could have derailed them, or it could keep moving them forward. And I think the same thing is true for us. I hope you don't face literal snakes very often in your life. That sounds terrifying. But hardship is guaranteed in life. We will face hardship. And those things can either derail us on our journey, or we can learn from them and move forward. When I think about the seasons of my life that shape me the most, it's usually the really hard ones. The times where I was experiencing a sense of loneliness or grief and loss. And I don't want to relive them. I don't think that God caused them. But afterwards, I left them with a deep sense of gratitude for what I gained through the process. Sometimes more meaningful relationships, or a deeper sense of self, or a more nuanced view of life. And like in this story, many of the things in my life that sometimes felt like they could destroy me were actually a source of healing and movement towards progress. This story also reminds me of one of the things that I really love about Christianity. And that's that in its best version, the story of our faith, I think, is trying to lead us into a better world, into a place where everyone feels safe and belongs and thrives. But just as in this story, that journey is slow. It has a lot of ups and downs, a lot of metaphorical snakes, if you will. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of faith. At its most basic level, the story reminds us not to get complacent with the slowness of our movement towards wholeness. It can be easy to settle into the deserts of our lives and think, well, this is as good as it gets. But I think we're called to continue moving forward, to create and foster the type of world where everyone has a place and everyone thrives. In Santa Cruz in particular, we don't have to get all symbolic about this. We have some very literal wandering through Santa Cruz County, people wandering through Santa Cruz County looking for a place to feel safe and to thrive. You all took many of them in last month. I hope this story helps attune us to their journey, gives us a little more empathy for them, helps us have a sense of mutual responsibility to care for the people around us, and helps us realize that, like many of the characters in this story, the folks that are experiencing homelessness in Santa Cruz are fully human. They are capable of miraculous things and wild disappointments and everything in between, just like we all are. One recent example of this is a shelter member named Travis, who you may have met back in the summer when we were here in the month of August. Travis came to the shelter very reluctantly. Myself and a volunteer had to literally convince him to come in, which we don't normally do. Normally, if someone doesn't want to come to the shelter, we're not going to twist their arm to get them in. But Travis had been homeless for 20 years in Boston, in Northern California, and then in Santa Cruz. And he hated the idea of shelters. He had never been in a shelter in those 20 years, had just a really negative idea of them. But he was at his wit's end. This was the end of last winter, after storm after storm after storm. And being outside and all of that had just worn him down. And he was running out of options and places to be. And so we finally convinced him to come in. And he was really pleasantly surprised by what he found. It was much more welcoming and warm in terms of the shelter members who were greeting him, the staff, the volunteers. Just a better experience than he thought. But it wasn't perfect. He was a little rough around the edges. 20 years on the street will do that to you. I would be rough around the edges too if I slept outside for 20 years. And like the characters in our story, he wasn't always enthusiastic. We would joke with him, he knew this, that he could be a real grump sometimes. He liked to complain every once in a while. And he knows this as well. He got himself pretty close to being kicked out on numerous occasions. Those rough edges would kind of boil over in conflict sometimes. But what I appreciate about him, much like the people in our story today, is that he would always kind of come back around. He would apologize if he needed to, and then he would express gratitude for being in community. Now, one of the reasons that Travis had such a hard time and that he was chronically homeless was because of epilepsy. So Travis had a pretty severe epileptic disorder. It prevented him from working, from maintaining income. It caused hospital stays throughout his life, just compounding medical issues. And so combining that with what he would admit and acknowledge were seasons of heavy drinking and poor choices, he ended up disconnected from community, on the streets, lost all income, in a really rough place. Now, over time in the shelter, some of those rough edges were kind of softened as his life bumped up with other people's lives, and we got to see him open up a little bit. He began to take ownership of both the community and the spaces he was in, taking really good care of the churches that host us. And he regained sort of a better version of himself. As this was happening, his name came up on the Section 8 wait list, which is subsidized housing. And we were very excited. He was not, which confused us. What he told us, though, was this is the third time his name had come up and he'd received a voucher. And every other time, he was unable to find an apartment. So the voucher would expire. It was like having a coupon that you couldn't actually cash in at the store. So we encouraged him and said, no, like this time can be different, we'll help you. And he was feeling a little more confident in his own abilities. And so he decided, this is going to be different. I'm going to approach this differently. And he spent a couple days walking up and down Pacific Avenue, getting every rental application he could. Going in, introducing himself, kind of selling himself, did so much work. And it paid off. Within a month, he was approved for an apartment. He was excited, but also nervous. First time having housing in a long time. We were also a little nervous for him, if I'm being honest. We weren't quite sure how he would do. And so he told us, he said, I'm going to come back almost every night for dinner just to stay connected. And we said, that's amazing. Please do that. We welcome it. He did for about a week or so, and then he stopped showing up. And staff, we were all sort of thinking, oh man, this doesn't feel great. Hopefully he didn't have a seizure and is injured, or like abandoned his place. So I tracked him down, took him to lunch just to check in. And it turns out the reason he wasn't showing up was because he liked his apartment so much he didn't want to leave it. And he started to tell me what his life was like now. And he said, every morning I get up and I bought myself a French press coffee maker, and I make French press coffee, and I sit in a chair and I look out my window and I watch the sunrise over the boardwalk, and I'm just so grateful to be here. And it was one of those moments where, after all the wondering and the complaining and the ups and the downs, it felt like Travis had arrived at some place that was a promised land where he could thrive and feel safe. And Travis's story is not over. I'm sure there will continue to be ups and downs, but it was a moment that reminded me of the truths of this story. That in our individual lives and our collective lives, we can move to something better together. And I'm so grateful for the ways that you all have done that in the lives of our shelter members. And I hope that we can continue to move forward through the ups and the downs, the hardships, the metaphorical snakes, into a better place.